Rain lashed against the windows. Wind howled like a hungry beast. The old oak tree swayed violently, its branches scraping against the roof. Inside, David sat alone, a book in hand. Each flash of lightning illuminated the room. The power flickered. The television screen blinked out, plunging the room into darkness. This was the third power flicker in an hour. He reached for his phone. No signal. He noticed a movement in the garden. He spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing. The house groaned as if in sympathy with the storm. It was an old house, full of creaks and shadows, even on the sunniest of days. Tonight, it felt alive, every rustle and moan amplifying David's growing unease. He wished he hadn't insisted on staying home alone tonight. Another deafening thunderclap, closer this time, shook the house. The lights went out completely, plunging him into absolute darkness. He swore under his breath, fumbling for his phone, its flashlight a beacon in the sudden blackness. His heart pounded in his chest, a drum against the silence of the house. He tried to rationalize his fear. It was just a storm, just a power outage, nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, a primal fear was taking root, whispering that he wasn't alone. It started subtly. A soft scratching sound from downstairs. He froze, listening intently. There it was again. This time a thump. It seemed to be coming from the basement door. His blood ran cold. He hadn't been down to the basement in years. The scratching sound continued, more insistent now. It was joined by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. David's breath caught in his throat. He knew he should ignore it, write it off as the storm playing tricks on his mind. But the sounds were growing louder, more distinct. He gripped his phone tighter, the cold metal grounding him in the face of his mounting terror. He told himself it was just the wind, rattling pipes, a stray animal finding shelter from the storm. But the logical explanations did little to quell the rising panic in his chest. The growl came again, closer, followed by a series of heavy thumps, like footsteps pacing back and forth beneath the floorboards. David's imagination ran wild, conjuring up images of monstrous creatures lurking in the darkness below. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't just stay here, paralyzed by fear. He had to face whatever was down there. Or at least, try to convince himself it was nothing. With a deep breath, David moved towards the basement door. The air grew noticeably colder as he approached. He stretched out a trembling hand and grasped the doorknob. It was ice cold, sending a shiver down his spine. He hesitated for a moment, the sounds from below growing louder. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The musty smell of damp earth and something unidentifiable filled his nostrils. He pointed the beam of his phone down the creaking wooden steps, the light swallowed by the impenetrable darkness. His finger hovered over the switch at the top of the stairs. Another growl, closer than before, spurred him into action. With a flick of the switch, a single bare bulb illuminated the stairwell in a sickly yellow glow. The steps stretched down into the abyss, each one seeming to whisper a warning. He took a hesitant step onto the first tread, the wood creaking ominously beneath his weight. Each step down the creaking staircase took David deeper into the heart of the house. The single light bulb cast long, distorted shadows. He reached the bottom of the stairs, his heart pounding. He swept the beam of his phone across the room. At the far end of the basement stood a figure. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as David stood there, frozen in place, his breath caught in his throat. The figure remained motionless, shrouded in shadow, yet its presence seemed to fill the entire basement. An icy dread gripped him, paralyzing him with fear. He couldn't tear his eyes away. Slowly, as if sensing his gaze, the figure turned. A long, skeletal hand emerged from the folds of its garment, its fingers long and bony, tipped with what looked like sharp, pointed nails. The hand reached out towards him, a silent beckoning. David's blood ran cold. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the figure in the shadows. It took a step closer, and another, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. The single light bulb flickered, plunging the basement into momentary darkness. David blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust. When the light flickered back on, the figure was gone. Relief washed over David, followed by a wave of dizziness. He had to get out of there. He turned to leave, his heart still pounding in his chest, his mind racing. But as he took a step back, he felt something cold and metallic brush against his hand. He whipped around, his phone clattering to the floor, the screen cracking as it landed. The light flickered out, plunging him into absolute darkness once more. He stumbled back, his hand reaching out, searching for something, anything to steady himself. His fingers brushed against something cold and damp. He recoiled instinctively, his heart hammering against his ribs. A low, guttural growl echoed through the darkness, closer this time, right in his ear. A cold, bony hand clamped down on his shoulder, its grip vice-like. David gasped, a scream trapped in his throat. He thrashed against the unseen assailant, his mind screaming in terror. He was lifted effortlessly off the ground, his feet dangling uselessly in the air. The growl reverberated through him, sending shivers down his spine. He caught a whiff of something foul, like rotting flesh, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was not alone. His screams were swallowed by the darkness, lost in the vast emptiness of the basement. He was completely at the mercy of whatever had him in its grip. Panic surged through him, hot and suffocating. He thrashed harder, his struggles growing weaker with each passing moment. A cold, clammy hand reached out, its bony fingers tracing a line down his cheek. He squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face. "Let me go," he whimpered, his voice barely a whisper. But there was no answer. Only the sound of his own ragged breathing and the low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. He was dragged backwards, his body bumping against unseen obstacles. He caught glimpses of movement in the darkness, fleeting shadows that seemed to twist and contort before his very eyes. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, making him gag. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. He was released, his body crumpling to the cold, hard floor. He lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. He couldn't see, couldn't hear anything over the pounding of his own heart. Slowly, he pushed himself up to a sitting position, his back against the damp basement wall. He wrapped his arms around himself, as if trying to hold himself together. His mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion. What had just happened? He knew deep down that he wouldn't find any rational explanation for the horrors he had experienced in the darkness of the basement. And a part of him, the terrified, rational part, didn't want to know. The storm raged on outside, but the sound seemed distant now, muffled by the weight of his terror. He sat there in the darkness, paralyzed by fear, every creak and groan of the old house sending shivers down his spine. He didn't know how much time had passed when he heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. They stopped just outside the basement door, and then there was silence. A silence more terrifying than any sound he had ever heard. He squeezed his eyes shut, his body trembling, his mind screaming. He waited for the inevitable, for the touch of icy fingers, for the sound of that guttural growl, but there was nothing. Only the deafening silence and the feeling of unseen eyes watching him from the darkness. He was trapped, his fate uncertain, his mind forever haunted by the horrors he had witnessed.